So this was a long gospel, and it's a complicated one because it has so many components, and I'm only going to focus on only one sentence, really. My sheep hear my voice, and they know me, and they follow me. But before I do that, all the readings were actually complicated. So I just want to give a little bit of background. So during the time of the Maccabees, the Greek pagans, under a king named Epiphanes, conquered ancient Israel. And they started putting up their own pagan idols to be worshipped, and they built altars to them. But they also went into the temple and they desecrated it. They put up statues of their gods. And then they even took pigs and slaughtered them on the altar. And so for 2 years, the Israelites could not worship in their temple. But then Judas Maccabeus led them in a war to drive them out. And when the pagans were finally driven out, they went into the temple and they had to rededicate it and purify it because it was so defiled, and to remove all the pagan statues and reconsecrate the altar and so on. And then one of the things that happened was a miracle, a small miracle. They needed to light the lamps in the temple, but they only had 1 day's worth of oil. And so they used that 1 day's worth of oil, and the temple remained lit for 8 days. And so today they have menorahs to represent those 8 days that the lamp remained lit, and it's called Hanukkah, and that's the Feast of Dedication. Then we have the letter to the Hebrews, where it speaks of the blood of goats and sheep and the heifer's ashes, the cow's ashes, all those things that the Jews did to purify themselves and to save themselves. The author to the Hebrews said none of those things did anything. All they did was just remind them of their sins and how powerless they were. But when Christ came, and in him the new covenant was born, he replaced the old covenant, and with his own blood, he entered the heavenly sanctuary and brought salvation to all men, so that all men can be purified and sanctified by him. And so we have this scene in the Gospel of John. And John is doing something really intentional. He's giving us some historical data. He's saying it is winter. And that was the month of Kislev that was mentioned from the Old Testament reading. And Jesus is walking in the middle of the temple. And the irony there is really like delicious, because Jesus is the new temple. If you recall earlier in the Gospel of John, he said, "Destroy this temple, and I will rebuild it. I will raise it up in 3 days." And then John adds the little comment. They only learned this after the Holy Spirit came. He said he was referring to his body as the new temple. And so the new temple is standing in the old temple. The new covenant is now standing in the middle of the old covenant. And another amazing little insight that we're all going to miss. Maccabeus, when he opened the temple, brought out the showbread, the bread that they would put out, the holy bread. And now we have the living bread from heaven, Christ, standing in the portico of Solomon. That was the outside area of the temple to protect themselves. They would stand there during the winter because of the rain and the wind. And now the one who is greater than Solomon, the new son of David, is standing on the porch of Solomon and he's teaching. And the Jews come to him and say, "Do not keep us in suspense. Tell us, are you the Messiah?" But they really weren't asking for clarity. Those hypocrites were not in suspense because Jesus had given them plenty of information. He had given them enough evidence. Their problem was not suspense. Their problem was they rejected his word and failed to be converted. Because Jesus had spent the last 2 years traveling around Israel, performing miracle after miracle, making the crippled walk, feeding the thousands with a basket of bread in front of their eyes, raising up the dead in front of them, telling them that he is the living bread that came down from heaven and you must eat his flesh and drink his blood. And then just before this, when they were arguing with him, and he said to them, "Your father Abraham, yes, you're Abraham, he desired to see my day, and he finally saw it." And they looked, they said, Abraham was 3,000 years ago, and he saw your day? And Jesus answered them, "Before Abraham was, I am." That was the name that God told Moses was Yahweh, my name, I am. And you know how we know that they knew that he was calling himself God? They picked up stones to kill him because he blasphemed. And funny, they do it again in this scene. So, my sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me. And you know, that line should make us stop. We hear his voice all the time. We hear his voice in the gospel like we did today. We hear his voice in the divine liturgy. We hear his voice whenever the church teaches. And we hear his voice when our conscience nags us. And there are Christians today who hear his voice week after week after week, but they live like he was silent, that he no longer speaks. He tells us to forgive, and yet we hold resentment. He tells us not to speak ill of our brothers, and yet we gossip. He tells us to honor the sanctity of marriage, and we go around destroying it, and divorcing and remarrying, and divorcing and remarrying. He tells us not to look with lust, and yet we continue doing that. He tells us that life is precious, and yet we slaughter babies. And next are the elderly, because what good are they to society? They're just a burden. If that is us, we are not his sheep, because his sheep know his voice and they follow him. You know, a lot of times when we read this gospel, what do we say to ourselves? If it was us, we wouldn't have done that. If I was there, that wouldn't be me. I would have responded differently. I would have knelt before him and kissed his feet. You will never, ever understand the gospel until you can put yourself in their shoes and see yourself doing what they're doing. Then you will understand. And for me, I've had a lifetime of experience in rebelling and rejecting and not forgiving and holding grudges, so I can speak as an expert on sin. I never got it until I can see myself doing what they do and rejecting him. They didn't believe because they were already following another shepherd. See, all of us are sheep. And I know this is going to offend some people because, don't call me a sheep. Sheep are dumb. They follow a shepherd, right? Every one of us is a sheep because every one of us has a shepherd. It might be a false shepherd. It might be a dangerous one. It might be a celebrity. It might be a bad friend. But the worst shepherd is myself. Look at all the voices that are out there that are competing with Christ. All these voices. Make sure you wear the nicest clothes. People are looking at you. If you spend more money on this luxury or that luxury, you'll feel good about yourself. Or how about the voice of pride? When the church speaks and the church teaches, and we say, yeah, not for me. I know better. How many of us have become cafeteria Catholics? You go to a buffet. I like this, I don't like this. Oh, this one's good, I'll take a lot of that. We pick and choose the teachings that agree with us. Or how about the voice of apathy? It's not important to pray. You know what? It's not important to get to Mass. Well, you're all here. So at least we don't have the voice of apathy this morning. But I assure you, we still have those voices because we're going to have people walking in late. Yes, Lord, you are my shepherd. I will follow you. I hear your voice, but not today because the NFL is on. Or I'll show up late. It's okay. I get to make up my own rules. The danger isn't that we don't recognize Christ's voice. The danger is that we recognize it pretty darn well and we just choose to ignore it. And that's why this gospel is so harsh. And you know what? When the Good Shepherd spoke, he exposed their hearts, and they picked up stones to kill him. Christ is not silent. His voice has always been clear. Come back to confession. Forgive the person you've just refused to forgive. Put away the habits that dull your conscience. Stop living as if the Eucharist was just a symbol. Don't come to Mass just to receive communion because you think it's magical. See, unlike them, he's not keeping us in suspense. Instead, we keep him waiting. But yet, even now, he never gives up. No one can snatch them out of my hand. And those hands still heal us in the confessional. They heal us when we're being anointed. They feed us from the altar. They teach us through the church. He never stops calling. He never stops searching. But you know what? He's not going to drag us against our wills either. So this renewal, this feast of the renewal, and it's symbolized, you saw while Abuna was blessing the walls of the church and blessing the congregation, the sisters were redressing the altar to symbolize the renewal of the church. The altar is being renewed, it's being rededicated, but that's not the renewal. That's just a symbol of the renewal. Because it's not about changing the church, the architecture, or the mission statement. That's not the renewal that Christ is looking for. The renewal he's looking for is for us today to rededicate our lives to him, to say we are your sheep. He is the good shepherd that will extend his mercy to us, and he has promised us that no one can take us out of his hands, but we can choose to leave. Christ stands again in his temple, in this church, at this altar today, and he speaks the same words that he spoke in Jerusalem. And some of us are going to leave unchanged, and that's tragic. Some will still be waiting, saying to him, "Speak plainly to us." But others will finally decide to obey. So the difference isn't going to be in what he says. The difference is going to be in how we listen to him.